Hi, my name is Casey Matranga, and I am the newborn photographer for Narrow Road Productions based out of Soldotna, Alaska. Today, we're going to be covering all of my table posing. So I specifically cover a select few poses, which is the bum up, the side laying, head on hands, and the froggy position. Those tend to be my top favorites, so let's get started. For my beanbag poses, aka table setup, I actually use a card table that I got off Amazon. I also have a PVC system that I have bolted to it. So you can see underneath of my blankets, I have it bolted to this side so that my clamps can secure the blankets right over the top and hold really well. And then the PVC pipe goes up along the back just so that I don't have to fill whenever I'm editing later. So it just saves a lot of post-processing time for me. My posers that I use are the Hello Little Shape Shifter posing set. I do have one additional piece that I've purchased that has been extremely helpful, but this is the head piece and then the foot piece. And then these are the lifters, which for a select few poses, the lifters come in handy just to elevate under the head piece, especially just to give that extra tilt and angle with the baby's curve. This piece I primarily use whenever I'm doing prop poses. It just helps stabilize their head position so that the baby's more secure in the basket or the crate that they're nested into. It does come in handy whenever you have a spicy baby and you need to do more wrap shots and still get your table images. You can use all of the lifters and stack them up. For the blanket tower is what they coined the term in the Hello Little group. And then that way it holds their head secure. This will be under your blanket, so you get that nice solid backdrop and just get more variety to your gallery. So the pose on my table that I typically start with is my bum up pose. So to position my posers for that, I use the head piece and then the foot piece, and I basically shape them in a little bit of a V. The spacing apart is always going to depend on the baby because every baby's body composition is different. Some might have longer torsos than others. So that I'm always going to gauge once I get the baby in the position on these. You can always put your hand underneath and slide and separate or move them a little bit closer together as you need. So we have our super cute little model, and she seems like she's pretty ready to go. So we're gonna start with the bum up pose. So I typically like to kind of pre-pose them in my lap. So first what I'll do is have them laying on their back facing towards me. I like to use my finger to kind of uncurl their hands. Sometimes you have finger ninjas, but that makes it harder to get their fingers uncurled if you don't do it before you get them on the table. So I try to make them basically just hold my palm like this, and then I'm going to place it under their cheek so that they're already in that position. I do a lot of holds with my hand across just for security. I kind of use their cheeks as handlebars, if that makes sense. So it probably looks like I'm holding the baby in an awkward position, but it's quite safe and comfortable for them. And then I'm going to put my hand under their tush like this, and then turn them forward into my lap face down. And then I will also try to pose their legs in the back where I'm already getting their legs crisscross under their tummy. If they're not settling very well and they're having a hard time transitioning, then I can just gently rock back and forth because she's very secure in the hold that I have her in right now. For babies that are pressure sensitive or really just sensitive to posing transitions, this helps them, like while you're posing them in your hands, to where you're not just going like straight from here onto the table. It just kind of helps them settle in without feeling like they're being like abruptly adjusted. And then I gently slide my hand out from under their hands, and see that allows their fingers to be placed pretty flat and smooth on top of the headpiece of the poser. And sometimes I just feel them out because not all babies do well with transition, even if you do your best to just kind of swing them into that. So I'll just kind of feel them out. She's not fidgeting very much, so what I'm probably going to do is just go ahead and adjust the back side of her. So my right hand is going to come from behind and lift up underneath of the heel to try and allow space to just slide this front leg underneath. So that way she's got that nice propped up bum up position. If I feel like her knees are splayed out too much I can take my hand from behind and just push her knee under her abdomen a little bit more. So that gives her that nice little tilt and it just props up her tushy just a little bit more. Once I have them in this position, that's when I'm gonna apply my headband. Also, you can see that I have more of a gap right here, so I do wanna close that a little bit more. My goal is never to make sure that their knee is touching their elbow because every baby's flexibility is different. So for some babies, that would be extremely uncomfortable. So what I want to do is focus on my angles because that's going to give the illusion that that gap is closed entirely. Or pretty close. So I'm just gonna focus on just closing it a little bit. So you can just hold behind the hips here and just guide her hip forward just to curve just a little bit. If they're naturally pushing back without intentionally pushing back, then what you can do is adjust your poser underneath to just kind of help guide that a little bit more and just have that pressure applied against them so that their body doesn't push themselves back naturally. This cute little headband by Olive and Lace, and see that little bit of tickle sometimes will cause them to shift. So if they start to get a little squirmy or annoyed with me, I use one hand just to kind of help secure the pose. I'm not pushing on them because I'm not forcing them to do something that they don't want to do, but sometimes they just need a little bit of a moment or some soothing to just help settle. I find that it's different with every baby. Some babies love being patted on the tushy. Some like just being rubbed. That can be a little bit more stimulating for others. So I always start with the patting first and see how they respond to that. So you can see she actually helped me and kind of closed that little gap for me. So I'm almost ready to get in my shooting position. So once I'm ready, I'm gonna swing over to be at a 45-degree angle shooting down their nose, because you know the photography rule is never to shoot up someone's nostrils. It's not very flattering. So once I've moved over to where I'm basically shooting at a 45-degree angle down the bridge of their nose, you can see that the head from my angle, once you're in this position, you can see that their head is kind of blocking some of the light going across their face. So I don't want my only focal point to be in focus here. So what I'm gonna do is just add a little security on her body. See how she responds to that. She's doing pretty good. So I'm gonna take my thumb, place it in the middle of her forehead. I have big hands, so not everybody might be able to do this, so you can go a little bit higher. And I'm gonna take my hand behind her head as well. I'm gonna gently just guide her face up. And I'm gonna just slowly do it just to feel him out, because see, like her, she wasn't a fan of that. So sometimes whenever they're getting a little bit finicky about some of my more like minor technical details that I'm trying to pose, I like to do counter pressure or counter movement in another area of their body. It's kind of a little bit distracting for them. So sometimes certain babies will actually respond better to that if, while I'm trying to elevate her face up towards me, that I'm patting her tushy at the same time. Whenever I'm getting ready to shoot, I always end up putting my strap around my neck, because should the baby fidget or twitch in a way that I need to respond with one or both hands, I don't want to, one, drop my camera, two, end up hurting the baby with my camera. So I always have it safe and secure around my neck, or I like it asymmetrical around my shoulders just to balance the weight. So whenever I'm getting ready to shoot this position, again, I always like to be at a 45-degree angle down the bridge of their nose. So what I look for when I'm doing my composition is I try to make a V from where their spine meets the back of their head. So I want a V at the top of my frame for that specific angle. So that's the primary way that I shoot this pose. I do like to maximize every pose just to get a lot of images for variety in the gallery. So I like to take as many angles as possible. So this one, I also, after I get that initial wide shot, I like to come around. I like to get a little bit of a headshot and close up, because a lot of parents just love those close-up details of their little ones. So I come straight onto their face, grab focus on the eye, and then use the rule of thirds in this specific shot. So I always have the baby over to this side, and I like a lot of negative space off to the right. I also like profile shots from this position as well. Again, another close-up of their heads. So what I'm gonna do is come from above them, so that way I'm pointing down towards the side of their cheek. I'm gonna grab focus on the eye that's close to me, and again, rule of thirds with this one as well. So the pose that I like to transition the best from the bum up pose is the side laying pose. So first what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna change the position of my foot piece. So the foot piece and the head piece are actually parallel in this, but they're not parallel with my table shape. So I'm actually going to be keeping my head piece tilted kind of at the corner of the table here, and I'm moving my foot piece to where it's parallel and angling at a 45-degree angle towards the back corner of my table. So I move my foot piece first, and then what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take my left hand and I'm gonna push her elbow from the right, because I'm going to slide the elbow forward as I roll her body so that I can get her arms together for the essentially the praying hands pose. I don't just abruptly go straight into the pose every time. It's rare that I have an extremely easygoing baby that just lets me have my way with them. But I get them at least turned first and then just feel them out to see, like you could tell that woke her up a little bit, but then she quickly went back to sleep. So I'm just gonna let her settle for a bit, because sometimes I feel like the more that I mess with them too fast, I kind of sabotage myself and just make them angry at me. So now I'm gonna get her feet pushed back here. I actually don't aim for perfectly lined up feet every time. I actually like when the back foot is just kicked back up against their tush, and then the first foot on top is propped up kind of against the poser just a little bit, rather than having the feet completely parallel side by side. Not all babies like that position. I personally don't like that position when I'm sleeping because of my ankle bones touching, so I wouldn't think that it's comfortable for them. So you can see how I'm using the poser here to just help support her foot here. This is an excellent pose, especially for little boys, because obviously you're trying to hide their little manly parts down there. And I feel like this is an easier way to be discreet about that versus having their feet completely parallel side by side. So next I'm gonna take my left hand and I'm gonna put it under her palm of her right hand that's on top. And I'm gonna use that to kind of help elevate her head. And then just get that bottom hand out. And she's doing an excellent job straightening out her fingers for me. And I'm gonna lift her chin just a smidge. And then I'm gonna just give her a little bit of security with pressure by helping keep her arms in this position and just gently rocking her back and forth. Because babies don't have their nervous system developed all the way, they do have a lot of involuntary movements with their legs, which has a tendency to startle themselves and wake themselves up more. So I end up making a crisscross with my arms in this position. I find it easier with the angle of my left hand to help hold in this position. You can see that between my thumb and my finger is in no way putting pressure on her neck. In fact, it's just helping me maintain my pose, but also giving her a security feeling right now. My right hand, whenever they stick their legs out, I use my right hand to just kind of help hold, regardless if it's in the position or not. It just helps to relax them a little bit more whenever their knees are tucked up against them. So now that she is settling a little bit more, I'm gonna go and readjust her legs. So I'm always gonna put the bottom leg back first so that the top leg is positioned over the top of that. And sometimes I will just go ahead and keep my hand there as I shift my focus back to the front. So I'm gonna somewhat get in my angle of shooting. I always continue to look at the headband because it's crazy how little they move, but yet they can move so much. So we're gonna make sure her headband is positioned back how it looks cute in the front. So she's starting to fidget again. So we're gonna put the legs back and just hold, let her have a moment. You can tell she's being a little gassy. Just gentle rocking. So the position of my light whenever I'm doing the bum up and the side laying pose is extremely similar. So especially when I'm shooting a lighter color backdrop, I don't like to have my diffuser pulled too far forward to the front of the table, because if I have too much shadow going on back there with a lighter backdrop, it's going to essentially cast somewhat of a gray tone in the background. So I like to have the edge of my modifier pretty close towards the back, so it's filling behind the baby as well. So generally, whenever you're lighting your subject, you never want to light up their nose. I don't really, for a newborn session, ever want to light and rim from behind their head. I also don't want it to be more flat in front of their face, because then I lose a lot of detail and I don't get as many shadows that way. So to get the shadows that I accomplished in my photography with newborns, I have to where the angle of the light is a really similar position to how I shoot, where it's going down the bridge of the nose. So that way on this side of her body, I'm still getting those really nice shadows to keep in all that detail. When I have a baby that really loves their pacifier, I like to do a counter pressure whenever you're trying to pull, because if you haven't noticed, when you start to pull the pacifier is when they suck harder on it. So what I do is a little tap in between the eyes right here, and then just gradually pull. And then I don't stop tapping until I've got it all the way out. Sometimes they'll still fidget once you get the rest of it popped out. Most of the time, it works pretty well to where they don't respond at all, but it worked well enough to where she didn't startle and wake back up, because if I were to try to do that without tapping, she would have guaranteed to get mad at me over that, because she was hanging on to it pretty hard. Side laying I can actually get quite a few angles with. One of the ones that I recently started incorporating that actually seems to be a parent favorite is that when they're in this position, I'm just shooting directly from an aerial point of view, and composition of the baby is just right in the middle, just horizontal along with my frame. So unless I have a rock star baby that just lets me transition them from one pose to the next and we can fly through everything on the table, to avoid getting everything pooped on, I only really keep them undiapered during bum up and side laying. So if they're being a little bit fidgety and I know that they can either just use a snack or they'll probably just go right back into the next pose, I like to just pause in my flow after those first two poses, take them off the table and put a diaper on them for when I'm doing an egg wrap on the table, or if I'm going to do the froggy pose, or if I'm going to do the head on hands, because I can usually use different textiles to cover and disguise that the diaper is there. So whenever I'm shooting head on hands is one of the next ones I'll follow after I do the side laying pose, if everything is going smoothly. What I do is I remove the foot piece entirely, and I move the headpiece to be perfectly parallel with the front of the table. I usually have it pushed a few inches back though, because I don't want there to be any possibility of this teetering on the edge whenever baby is positioned on top of it. The likeliness of that happening is extremely slim, but I err on the side of being overly cautious whenever you have someone's little one in your hands. So I get the headpiece positioned under there. I also like to assist the angle with it too. I don't want the height of it to be bumped up too high, but I want the angle to be a little bit stronger. So what I'm going to do is take one of the lifter pieces, and I'm going to take the headpiece and tilt it up and place a lifter about halfway underneath of it. So that way you can see that it goes from flat to elevated up here. Just a little bit of a higher angle. I like texture, so I like to start incorporating, after the first couple poses, I like to incorporate some more layering pieces. So for head on hands, I usually will take a wrap of the same material of the backdrop or something that's coordinating, just depending on the colors and style that I'm going for. And I like to kind of place it where I take kind of somewhere in the middle and have it a little up and over the headpiece and both tail pieces towards the back. I don't usually like them even to where both tail pieces are covering both sides. So I'll take one side and usually swoop to my shadows side of the table, because the light source is going to be coming from this direction. So this is going to be my shadows side. And then I just mess with the fabric until it just kind of looks pretty and messy. So I like to bunch it up. I don't like whenever there's so much spread out that there's an unproportioned look of the layering piece underneath the baby to the size of the baby. So once I get it down there, I actually do start bunching it up quite a bit. because I just want little bits of the fabric out from underneath of the baby. So again, I like to pose as much in my hands or lap as possible, just to pre-pose the baby, just to help with the transition from my lap to the table. So I like to take both hands and put one palm over the top of the other. She's trying to decide how she feels about this. So I like to just go at their pace instead of rushing them and forcing them into my posing. So she's starting to set a little bit more. So now I'm going to take this hand and I'm going to go behind the nape of her neck. Try and get under my layer here. And then I'm going to use this hand. See how she kind of already is keeping her hands there? I'll use my thumb to hold her hands together as much as possible. Scoot her forward on my lap. Sometimes they'll undo that pose, but I can quickly get them back in there because they're already accustomed to that angle with their arms. So you can see that I'm gradually starting to get her comfortable with transitioning to her tummy. And again, I'm not going to rush her into this pose because that might kind of backfire on me. So she's still doing a little bit of fidgeting, which I always feel their body movement in my hands to gauge what they're comfortable with and what's going to be the next best move for them, because every baby is different. She's starting to settle into this. I can feel her body and her muscles relaxing. So now I want to try and get my index or my middle finger and my thumb under each elbow, because this is going to help keep her elbows up and then also help me get a secure grip on her rib cage. I don't squeeze on her rib cage, but again, I'm still holding her secure enough to where she's going to be safe. So she's starting to settle again. So now this hand is going to go under her tush and we're going to switch her to the table. Oh, she likes to extend her legs, so I'm going to just curl them up for a minute. And again, you can do a little bit of a transition movement for her just so that it's not an abrupt move from my lap onto the table. We call this the Simba swing. And she seems to love it. So she's starting to kind of twitch a little bit. I can feel her muscles tense up. So I'm just going to ease the front end of her onto this headpiece. And a lot of the times they're going to look like they're kind of like hunched over, which means that when you've got them set down, they're a little too far forward. You don't want them to be over the top of the middle of this because you don't want them to start to curve forward towards the front. So before I start getting technical with my posing, I like to let them settle into it because that was a big change for them. And she's doing really well at settling. I like to tuck the back of the diaper so that it's not sticking up and looking really bulky in the background. A lot of the times what I'll do is unclip just one side and fold it back and tuck behind, and then you can't see that it's underneath of them at all. In some cases, like this one, because I didn't untuck it, if I were to squeeze in here and undo that strap, it's going to make her upset, and then it's going to undo all of the progress that we've made. So what I can do is just take the edge of my wrap or my layer piece and just kind of drape it over her backside. I still, when I do that, like to get a little foot kicked out. And so the foot that I have kicked out is always going to be on my shadow side because I'm going to have, her body isn't going to be completely at a 90-degree angle on the table to where butt is straight away from me and head is straight towards me. Her head is going to be straight on towards me, but the back of her is going to slightly just shift to my left on the table, which is her right. So that way you can see a little bit more of her body in the background on the shadow side. So now that she seems to be settling pretty well, I'm going to use this hand and just securely get a hold of her head here. And then, oh, so she's not a fan. She's gonna need to settle a little bit more. Not all babies are comfortable, because a lot of babies, if you think about it, whenever they're in the womb, some of them are in certain positions that they favor for quite a while whenever they're in utero. So sometimes what that can do is cause a little bit of their alignment to be off. And so I can tell whenever some babies feel like a certain position with their neck is uncomfortable, because they might be tighter on one side versus the other. So if you see that they're favoring one side more than the other, I never try to force them into having their head perfectly straight and balanced with their head propped on their hands. I get it that in the photographer world, it's super cute, especially the more perfect you can make a pose. However, ultimately the pictures are for the mom. So I always have to remind myself during a session whenever I'm posing that I'm not posing for perfection. I'm posing for beautiful pictures of the parent's baby, and they're going to be happy regardless of how perfect it looks. So I typically like to let them just have their head tilted a little bit more to one side. If they favor having a more of a head tilt versus their head propped up perfectly straight up and down. She definitely is favoring, anytime I try to move her head, she keeps favoring keeping her head tilted to this side. So I'm definitely not going to force her to have her head straight up and down. So I'm going to use my hand to lift her head just a little bit, because what I want to do is adjust her hands a little bit more. I want to pull. See, she did a great job keeping her hands aligned. As I say that, she's going to pull them. So my finger, to keep them from pulling their arms off the lifter, you have a hard time seeing it, but my middle finger is actually underneath of her and putting counter pressure on her wrists. So anytime they start getting fidgety in this pose, I always put my fingers underneath the wrist, because the hardest thing to do is to pull their arms back up onto the poser, and that's what's going to upset them the most. So you can see that she got upset, but my hands are still there, keeping the pose intact as much as that I can, so that way later on I'm not disturbing her and working against myself. In addition to making sure that I have a finger tucked up underneath their arms, I also will have one or both where I have a finger actually in between the crease where their elbow is. I mostly do it on this side because my index finger and my thumb are actually holding her hands to be directly on top of one another. As soon as they pull away and have that separation of the wrists, it actually will allow them to curl forward more. And what we're trying to do is get her face more elevated up towards the camera. Plus, it just makes their hands look a little bit more cute and dainty when their hands are crossed over versus like over crossed. It gives the illusion that their hands are much bigger than what they are. Sometimes if I do have them a little bit too far forward on the curve of my poser, then you can use one hand to hold on and make sure that they're secure before you start moving the poser. But what I'm going to do is pull from the left. I'm not going to pull it straight forward. Her head is tilted this way, so by keeping it shifted in the same spot here, it still gives that support on this back side, because if I were to pull forward on both sides, she's more likely going to kind of sink backwards this way, and that's where their head doesn't sit well on top of their hands, and then their head starts angling and lifting off where the chin starts lifting off of the front of their arms. So what I'm going to do is take my shifter here and just gradually just pull it forward a little bit, but more swinging it at a slight angle. And that's how you can get them to lift up a little bit more towards the camera if you already had placed them initially too far forward on your poser, which I do all the time. So the hard part is retrieving my finger, because she's got it pretty nested in there. So I'm going to apply counter pressure on a different part of her, and just a little bit of a wiggle, and even just moving a little bit. She's pretty fidgety, so she is actually a pretty pressure sensitive baby, so that's why it's all that much more important to do counter pressure and counter touch. There we go. Beautiful. So Again, she also likes this foot tucked up under her abdomen. So I'm going to hold her in her pose so she doesn't wiggle out of it. I'm going to put my hand behind her at the nape of her neck where it's secure from her spine to the back of her head. And I'm just going to apply a little bit of a counter shake here. Shake is probably the worst term to use. You should never shake a baby, but a little bit of a wiggle just to distract her from what's going on down there. And then slowly, oh, young lady. So a little bit of a soothing motion. Babies love motion. If you think about it, they're in mommy's tummy being moved all the time. So if they're sitting on a perfectly still table while you're messing with them, they notice it a lot more. So once I've got them positioned and ready to shoot, then I'm gonna also make sure that my light is at the proper angle. So I also, again, want to shoot down their nose. I want the back of my modifier to fill the back of my backdrop, but I also want, now that her head is pointed a little bit more this direction than it would be for the bum up or the side laying, they're usually open a little bit more to this angle. She's still kind of turned away because she's positioned more towards the front of my table. So that means that she's turned and rotated this direction. So now my light needs to turn and rotate more of this direction. So again, I'm still going for the angle that it is shooting down the bridge of her nose. It's filling the back of my backdrop, but it's also still allowing me to get those really good shadows on this side of her body. Whenever I'm shooting my angle for this, I don't actually try to make sure there's a line from where their hands are crossed like this. I don't always try to make sure that perfectly goes parallel with the bottom line of my frame. I do if I'm gonna do a really close-up one, then I'll try to line that up as best as I can. Whenever I shoot from a little further back where they're actually centered in my frame, I don't do a rule of thirds for this angle. I'm looking for a little bit more of a shift in this direction. I don't want to be so far this way that their face is no longer flat up towards the camera. I'm shooting and looking for my angle to make sure that their face is pointed straight at me, but yet I still am not losing what's going on in the background with our body. So you get that cute little foot kicked out to the side and you're showing off a little bit more of what you have going on with the pose. So with my angle, I'm gonna step back just a smidge. I usually will keep hands on my fidgety babies until I'm ready to shoot. So again, shooting down the bridge of the nose. And with this position, you still have a little bit of that V with the back of the neck to the spine. The third shot that I like for this one doesn't yield as many angles as the side laying pose, but the third shot that I like for this one is my rule of thirds because I love negative space. So this is the one where I'm actually going to be pulled back the furthest. And I have seen some shots where photographers actually have the baby in the right-hand corner and all the negative space behind the baby. For this one, I actually like putting the baby in my far left corner and then having all my negative space off to the right of their head. So that's more of like a personal preference for your own artistry and the style that you want to convey. She keeps twitching and fidgeting, so she actually has moved herself on my poser. So to give her more support, because I can feel her sliding backwards, I'm gonna just hold my hand in the back of her neck, because again, I don't move something with a baby without one of my hands always being on them. I'm going to use my hand, and they're sticky to these blankets, which is why I love them, because they don't move around like the beans do when I used to use the posing beans. So I'm gonna hang on to the blankets and then use one or two of my fingers to actually pull the blanket towards me, push the shifter back under her elbow just a little bit more. And it actually angled it instead of pushing it flat up back towards her that way, which is totally fine. And then if you need to uncurl the fingers again, if you have a baby that's really gassy and they just have clenched fists, again, that just goes down to the mom's still gonna like it anyway, so pick your battles. I find that I spend way too much time on detail like that and have the parents here for so long when really it just doesn't matter to the mom as much as it matters to us. Okay, so for this angle, I actually like to grab the front of my fabric, especially if it's not a patterned fabric, because you don't see that there's much of a stretch going on, and I didn't give myself much space. I normally have more fabric hanging down the front of my table. So what I'm gonna do is, I don't like a lot of the shadows because I have my posers elevated so much. It does cast a pretty dark shadow on this side of it. So what I like to do for this pose is I like to grab it, lift, and pull at an angle upwards, because that saves me a lot of editing time later, trying to balance out those shadows in the picture. So I'm gonna grab focus on her eye, and I'm actually, you can see that instead of shooting in front of her like the first two shots that I took, I'm actually gonna shift a little bit more, and I'm gonna shift a little bit more of like a side angle on this one. So whenever I notice that I have a baby that has super clenched hands during a lot of their posing, and you can just feel that their body isn't quite relaxing, usually to me that is a signal that they are struggling with gas, which is really uncomfortable when you're a baby because you don't really understand what's going on. You just know you don't like it and it hurts. So if it's affecting my posing too much, what I'll do is pause, put baby on their back in this position. She's not currently gassy at the moment, so I doubt we're actually gonna get any results from this, but I just wanted to show you a really great little tip that has helped me tremendously with gassy babies. So what I do is have them on their back in my lap. I usually have their little tush up towards where my pelvis is, and then that way their head isn't going over the backs of my knees. And then I grab their ankles, so the tops of my hands go over the top of their ankles, and then my thumb goes up under the arch of their foot. So what I'm gonna do is the little bicycle for them. So if you do one leg at a time, their intestinal direction actually goes towards their left side. So it's just kind of like this little cycle of going clockwise, essentially, in their tummies. So you can do one leg at a time towards the middle. What I notice helps a lot, because their intestines aren't just in the middle, it goes towards the sides of their abdomen region, is that you kind of do the bicycle and work your way from the middle and then out to the sides. Which she does have to poop, so hopefully this helps her. As you're doing the bicycle, you work towards the middle and then out to the sides, and then you can pause and press their knees into their abdomen a little bit. Sometimes you can feel them tense and kind of push against you, so I don't push too much into their abdomen if they're really just not liking it. Again, because their tummy's already uncomfortable, they might just be really frustrated with just the feeling. So you're not trying to squish them like a little bug, but you are trying to help them and encourage those little tummy bubbles to come out. So you do bicycle, bicycle, push, bicycle, bicycle, push. And almost when I know that I'm dealing with gas, like 9 out of 10 times, it's extremely successful. Right now, that's not the issue. Little girl just has to poop. Okay, so for the Froggy pose, I keep my positioners or my posers here the same exact way that I have head on hands. That's why I like doing these poses close together. Sometimes I'll do Froggy first and then head on hands, or vice versa. It just depends on the baby. I do change the position of my light. So even though the posers are the same way and the baby's face towards me, I actually like to take my modifier and just slightly kick it out this way, because I like a little bit more of like a moodier lighting on Froggy. And even with head on hands, their face is still turned away a little bit. So that's why I have the modifier kind of curved around the front. For Froggy, they are 100% being feathered from your light on the right. So I like to kick my light out just a little bit, just to help preserve a lot of those really great shadows on the opposite side of their face. So to style a Froggy set, I usually always like to have a type of fabric or texture layer. I do like the really simple style ones where I don't have a fabric or texture down, but I usually do those whenever I have a lot more color incorporated. Because I'm doing like whites and off-whites, I like having more texture just so that it doesn't look like a really big empty space. In addition, this bonnet was very inspiring. This is by K2C Blooms. She probably makes some of my most favorite bonnets ever. She does them all by hand, and she just has some really creative styles and color combinations. So I wanted some spring flowers. So I usually like to use fake flowers for this set, because when I'm saving my fresh florals for my floor sets later, I want to preserve them being on a stem. And for these ones, I need to have pretty short stems whenever I'm placing them on my table for the Froggy pose. So I like just placing random ones around for filler. You can see I only have 2 sizes here, which is totally okay. I like a lot more of a diversity in my flowers when I'm doing the floor sets, but this is meant to just be simple and super cute. So simple is totally fine. And actually, there was enough variation in the tones because there was 2 shades on just this one size. So I like making sure that I have them a little bit spaced out. I usually like one of the little flowers, at least one of them, up closer to where their little foot is going to be. So that way this flower is going to be the most in focus. Everything is going to be in a much softer focus behind the baby. Here I am getting ready to pose her in my lap before I'm ready to approach the table. So she can tell that I'm getting ready to do this. So she's all of a sudden decided to start getting twitchy. But I'm going to pose one hand close to her cheek. And then I'm going to use my hand to hold it there while I rotate her in my lap, and still holding that there on her cheek. I'm going to move my bonnet tie to the back of her shoulder so that it doesn't get caught, because then it's really hard to retrieve that later. Now we're going to place the other hand on her cheek. This hand is going to hold it there. Now my thumb is going to come across so that I can release this hand. And then we're going to rotate her back to this side, because that's the side that I can get a more secure hold on her. Also, because she was being twitchy, I've got her on her side. Before I, again, mess with her some more, I want to just let her settle into this position of the feeling of having her hands on her face. Some babies can be extremely particular about their hands touching their face. So I try to just ease them into this without upsetting them too much, because again, like, even though they're a baby, they are their own person. So I try to be as respectful of them as I can. So she seems to be doing pretty well. So now I'm going to use this hand to elevate her upwards. And then I'm grabbing from the front and from behind. I'm going to slide her forward in my lap a little, get her in sitting position. So that way she's accustomed to the feeling of sitting upright. Little leg stretch. Do a little bit of a shifting back and forth. She seems to be doing pretty good in this. So I'm going to lift her tush. I usually just let their feet dangle. Again, the little Simba pose, but this time with her hands against her cheeks. And then I'm going to kind of rest her feet first and then slide her tushy back. Because that's, oh, that was a good burp. That's ultimately going to just accomplish my pose without me setting her down and then having to pull on her legs and kind of mold her more after she's already in this position. She's essentially already in Froggy pose by the time her tushy sits on the table. So now where I like to mess with my detail. So again, I said bonnet ties, flower up by the foot. Bonnet ties are on this side. So I want to be a little bit more asymmetrical. I'm going to move the flower to be on this side close up to her foot. So now that I've got her in this position and I've moved the flower to the opposite side, I'm gonna switch to my supportive hand is gonna be on this side because now I need to adjust her bonnet ties. And you can see that this foot's kicked out a little bit more because she's a pretty flexible little girl. If my baby is starting to unsettle while I have them in froggy position, I have one hand secure in the front, another one at the nape of their neck, and then I do a really gentle rocking back and forth. You don't want to do too much because you're essentially kind of hinging their spine at their hips. So I do it just enough just to give them that little settling feeling of movement without affecting their skeletal structure. I forgot to mention that before I even get them on the table and start posing them in my lap, I like to always make sure that my camera is on the right side of the table. The reason is that once I'm in their final position, it's always my left hand holding the baby. This is always a pose that is done by a composite. So a composite is to where you're going to take two images to create your final image. So that way in this pose, my hands should never be entirely leaving this baby. Because I'm going to be shooting with my right hand and holding the baby with my left hand, I need to easily grab my camera without my strap having to cross over and accidentally bump the baby or even risk dropping my camera. If the baby's doing pretty well in this position and they're good and settled in, I like to take one final look, especially if I'm decorating it, just to make sure that all the flowers are going to be in a really pretty composition to the final image. And she's doing really excellent, so I think we're going to go ahead and try and steal the pacifier. She's not sucking on it really hard, so I don't need that counter pressure this time. She released it really well. Look at that cute face. Because she has a bonnet on, I'm going to just make sure that she has more than one finger showing in the front here because it is a pretty, because of the detailing on the rim of this bonnet, it has kind of like enough 3D going on that it's going to hide most of her hand. So I want to show more than one finger on each side. So I'm going to take my camera, make sure my strap is over my head. And then I always lift off of my stool because again, she's propped up pretty high because she's elevated on the posers. So I want to be shooting down her nose for this one. And she's starting to twitch. So before I get ready, I want to make sure she's going to be safe and secure. Okay. So I'm always going to shoot straight on and grab, focus on her eye. Take a look, make sure everything looks great. I always do a couple of shots on this one. I actually like to do a couple shots where I grab focus on one eye and then a grab focus on the other eye just to make sure that everything is in position. Now that I've looked at my picture, I kind of want to tweak some of my flowers. I want that pulled out just a little bit further to fill the frame some more. So to talk through a little bit of this pose about why it's built the way that it is that the elevation here gives her a little bit more of a natural shift in her weight. So that way, not all of the support is resting on her front half. It's shifting a little bit more to her back half to balance better. The other thing is with the elbows, the reason why the feet come forward is because that is supportive of the elbows to help hold in place. Ideally, is if you were to take your hands off, these feet should be supporting the backs of the elbows so that they do have the capability of sitting in this position on their own. However, because their nervous system isn't developed all the way, they could have those random twitches and essentially flop over and hurt their necks, hurt their spine, hurt any kind of possibility, and we definitely don't want to risk that happening. But as you can see, I'm barely giving her any support. She's in a really good position here. She has a beautiful froggy going on. So now we're gonna get our shots. She does have one hand up a little higher than the other, but again, I don't fuss over detail like that quite as much. So not all the time will I even remove the pacifier for the first shot because really I'm just going for a seamless shot above the head. So now I'm going to see if she'll let me take the pacifier, which she's not a fan of yet. So once I release the pacifier, I'm going to slowly see how she does by taking my right hand and shifting the hand that's supporting underneath to the opposite. I want to make sure that we bring that foot back for support. And now my left hand is gonna go over the top. I have really big hands, which is in my favor because I take my index and my thumb and I find her temples because that's a nice little nook that makes me feel like I've got a hold of her head without any possibility of slipping around such a round surface. So once my top hand is secure, I'm gonna slowly release the bottom hand. Okay, if she lets me, this is where I'm gonna be picky. So when I have a baby that's being a little bit fussy and I'm not quite sure if I mess with too much, if I'm gonna sabotage myself, I always do my safety shots first. So safety shots are where you're like not 100% happy with the pose or something in the image, but yet you don't necessarily want to kind of destroy the image or the pose by messing with them too much. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna fidget with her a little bit more now that I have my safety shots. Whenever I'm shooting for the egg wrap on the table, I leave the positioners of my headpiece and my foot piece extremely similar to how I'm going to shoot bum up. So I have them kind of wedged in a little bit of a V. But for this one, I also like to elevate the headpiece a little bit more by tucking a little lifter under the outside half of the headpiece. So once I have them wrapped in the egg wrap, I always have a little bit of tail here in the back. Sometimes you can use it to just kind of be decorative and flow off in the back of your image. The time I just tuck it and hide it. Once I have baby position, I don't really get really picky about a lot of the details of how the wrap is fixed quite yet. I just want the foundation of it ready to go. And then once I get them on my positioners, I have them with their head kind of pointing towards the front corner of my table and their little bottom is faced about a 45-degree angle towards the back corner of my table. So once I get them in position, I try to just kind of ease them into it. She's loving this. And then I want their face to be turned a little bit towards me. Now, she has a pretty straight line from where her face is to the front of her body, with this line where her back is up the side of her face. I like to kind of close out a little bit and get a little bit more of a tuck. So what I can do is just grab her bottom, kind of pull just a little bit. And what that does is it just allows her head to just ease into the curve of this headpiece here. The further you have their head towards the top of it, the more it's going to give you that straight line or almost even make their head look like it's tipped over it a little bit. I like, because they're in an egg wrap, I like it to be nice and circular if I were to take an imaginary line and draw it around the front of the baby. So now you can see that the wrap has kind of come up pretty high on her legs. This is where I start fixing my finishing look of my egg wrap. If it's a baby where I know they like to be really tucked in and secure, I try not to open it up too much. Some babies are totally fine if you open it up more and show some more leg. The last thing I'll do is if their face is turned away from my light more and kind of tucked down, I have a lot of babies that I call chin tuckers where they're most comfortable when they're kind of like closed up like this. It just makes them feel really safe. The last thing that I do is I try to just elevate their head just a little bit towards camera, but also being mindful of their flexibility. Every baby is born differently. As humans, like I am not a flexible person, no matter how much I tried, there is no doing the splits for this girl. So I always pay as much attention as I can to what baby's telling me with their flexibility. Some babies can really elevate their head. Some, they're just a little bit more stiff. So I'm not going to force it. Instead, I'm going to move my light if I need to. But in order for me to get the best angle, I do like to elevate just a little bit. So whenever I'm shooting, again, I like to be at a 45-degree angle shooting towards their backside. So I want her tushy facing away from me. I like their faces elevated up a little bit towards me. And then whenever I'm shooting for my frame, so I, again, always look for that little V right there. So where the side of her head meets that line in her body. I never shoot to where the side of her face is parallel to the bottom of my frame. It just makes it look like she's almost like falling, toppling over backwards in like a backwards somersault. I don't always like them sitting up necessarily either. So I just really like that angle where, again, there's that little V right there. I always start shooting wide and grab the eye that's closest to me and then go in a little bit closer each time. Whenever I change my angle, I like to shoot where their nose is straight up and down in the camera. I crop into their head just a little bit, and I get this one really tight. And so then I crop up to about the back of their knee right there. And then shoot with their face a little bit more straight on to me. And if they're being a little squirmy, just giving them little taps on the tush. And then another one I like to do is a portrait orientation. So this one, it's gonna look like I'm shooting almost the same way, but I'm gonna look for putting her head in the top of my frame, her tushy towards the bottom, and then I want the head to angle off to the left side of my frame. Because you don't get a lot of angles with this pose on the table, I also like to take them already wrapped and then just go straight into a bucket that I already have prepped ahead of time. So that way you wrapped them once and you have two completely different looks and setups. Thanks again for watching. I really hope you enjoy these videos, and I really hope that you were able to learn a lot and take away some valuable information to help improve and elevate your brand and your artistry.